Welcome to another edition of History of Role-Playing, and on this topic we're going to talk about crimes and punishment. Nearly every long adventure I've been involved with has resulted in prisoners. Fortunately, most of them were me capturing prisoners, since vice versa is most unpleasant and usually handled through digressions. Most games do not deal with this most gruesome aspect of high adventure, yet nearly every adventure movie involves some sort of capture and torture with execution. Just think of Braveheart, Gladiator, even The Matrix, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Star Wars, Spartacus, Kill Bill, and every James Bond movie ever made. Being at the mercy, or lack thereof, of a victorious adversary is exciting, even terrifying, and filled with unknown possibilities, most of which are not pleasant. Having control of this adversary's minions, who has the key to foiling the evil plans, is challenging. Most of these movies listed have a scene where the hero is going to be executed, out of sight of the main villain, by some exotic method, and in which case he has an opportunity to survive. This is the stuff of adventure and fiction, but not history. In the historical movies, the hero is put to death. Crime and punishment. Well, what age should we start in? Well, a prisoner is usually in the hands of the state, a villain, or the player. When they are a prisoner of the state, it is usually for a crime. A trial and sentencing should ensue. In the course of arrest, incarceration, trial, sentencing, and execution of sentence, there are a myriad of possibilities, and the entire adventure can take place concerning just these events. Hammurabi's Code of Laws, the first recorded set of laws, are a list of the 288 crimes and punishments. English common law in the late Middle Ages, since that seems to be the most adaptable to most fantasy gameplay. In the Middle Ages, prisons were a place to hold people until trial and sentencing. Corporal punishment was a common practice. If your sentence was to be imprisoned for a length of time, usually life, it was in terms of exile or house arrest. These sentences were reserved for royalty, nobility, and famous individuals. Queen Elizabeth kept Mary, Queen of Scots, as a prisoner in several castles over the years. Mary was only executed after she was found guilty of complicity in an assassination plot. Galileo lived out his life in a villa for advocating Copernicus's theory for a sun-centered universe. Manslaughter, robbery, murder, rape, piracy, the sentence is usually to hang. They always made the caveat that you would hang until dead. Early advocates for the law who said the man is now hanged, take him down. Women are not usually hanged, but instead are burned. Lucky them. Crime for treason, for instance. The criminal is dragged to a place of execution on a sled. He's hanged until half dead, then his arms and legs are usually cut off, then he's disemboweled, with all parts thrown into the fire for view. This is commonly known as being drawn and quartered. If a nobleman is convicted for these crimes, the sentence is commuted to a simple beheading. For willful manslaughter while committing a robbery, the criminal is to have their right hand cut off near the place where the act was done, and then they are led to the place of execution, where they are hanged in chains and left until their bones are consumed to nothing. A felon, or as it was commonly known as a fell one, is someone who is deemed evil. Their crimes are breach of prison, disfigures of a prince's liege, assaulting someone of the church or the state, adultery, whoredom, and in each case the person was made to bond or made the slave of somebody that he injured. Some were actually condemned to galleys, especially in the Mediterranean region. Simple manslaughter was a purse crime, and the punishment was rated by the state of the party killed. If the offender could not pay, then hanging was the sentence. If you had a full purse, you might get off. Witches, of course, were hanged or burned. In Spain, if they recanted and kissed the cross, they would be garroted before burning. If they just recanted, they would be burned with seasoned wood. If they did neither, they would be burned with green wood. Even as a chemist, the differences can sometimes escape me. There's lower heat with green wood, more smoke. Is that the smell of redemption? Anyone can add their thoughts in the chat. Rogues and vagabonds, people who wander into town, are usually whipped and then put into stocks. It was always assumed that an outsider was going to commit some sort of crime. Why else would they be there? They would be placed in a public place and be exposed to ridicule and abuse. If anyone were to vouch for them, then they could perhaps get out. Scolds, or people that just disturbed the peace, were usually just dunked repeatedly into water. Whether they drowned it or not was not the sheriff's fault. People need to be made of sterner stuff. If a felon does not admit to his crime but remains silent, they are pressed beneath a board on which large stones are placed. A sharp stone is placed under their back. If a felon confesses to a crime, then his goods are merely confiscated. If they do not confess, they will remain a felon, as well as having the felon title attached to both their wife and all their children. If you could read, and it was your first offense, and your crime was not the theft of livestock, oxen, sheep, or actually taking money, which was quite rare because coinage was actually quite rare, it was not considered highway robbery. Instead, it was considered more breaking and entering or armed robbery. The highway robbery distinction was left only for the King's Road. Normal felony robberies, not on the King's Highway, you were burned on the left hand with an iron, so that if you repeated your felony again, other law enforcement districts would know that you've already been given mercy once. This only seems to be common in English common law. Capital punishment for robbery was almost the norm until the modern age. Pirates and robbers at sea are hanged on the shore at low tide and left until 3 tides wash over them. Then their families could claim the body. Rebels who took arms against the state were frequently made to sit under a heated iron throne covered with spikes, and a red-hot iron crown was placed on their head. Prisons did not become the norm until the 18th century. When they did, a prison sentence was tantamount to a death sentence. One of the most heinous prisons was the Bastille in Paris. Most people that entered the Bastille did not last 6 months due to disease and the deprivation of the guards. If you were rich enough, you could pay the guards to keep you alive. In the 18th century, it also saw the establishment of penal colonies such as Australia. Large numbers of people were simply deported to a foreign land to do work service for the crown. For many people, this was seen as worse punishment than hanging. The number and severity of a punishment would have a great deal to do with whether or not lenience by the monarch or local justice would be granted. Over 72,000 people died by execution under the reign of Henry VIII, including several of his wives. Frequently, the local constable would not arrest a criminal who committed a crime in another jurisdiction. They would always say, "Let God restore your loss. I have other business at this time." It seems that only if you are apprehended quickly would justice also be swift. Should we go on to torture, or has this topic become grim enough? If you want to extract information from some miscreant after you've captured him, how do you do it? Do you ask them nicely? Do you offer them a bribe? Will you let them live if they tell you who sent them? Torture is something that appears often in RPGs, probably too often. So you have been captured and now information is going to be extracted from you, the character. Torture is dark and serious even in game terms, but in history, it is even more vile and despicable. It was so reviled that constables and guards could be punished if they actually tormented prisoners. Torture was reserved only for the church. Later, the state also claimed that torture could be extracted for those guilty of treason. But heresy was the #1 place for church crimes, for canon law crime violations would you suffer torture. There is a difference between torture and punishment, though they are not necessarily exclusive. Someone who stole could be placed in the stocks in public display. Many would consider that torture. They would be exposed to ridicule and the elements. Passers-by were almost expected to abuse them. They could be marked with a brand or have a hand cut off. In the legal system of the United States, that would be considered torture. In the legal systems of most kingdoms, this is simply punishment. Torture was the primary means used to extract information and confession. Someone who is accused of heresy could be placed on the rack until they recant. Many people who received the rack actually lived to lead a productive life, but most of them were crippled. It was also administered for entertainment for the crowd. The rack was a sort of public event that could be used to extract a convention from a very stubborn heretic. It is also a method of making an example of someone to prevent further indiscretion. This would happen if the victim fell into the hands of bandits, outlaws, or pirates especially. They loved to publicly rack and torture people. Torture has been refined over the years to adapt new technology, but the main purpose is still to break the will of the victim. If in ancient time you were experiencing torture, you would be exposed. They would leave you simply outside in the cold as you would shiver. Eventually they would drag you around the city. Your body parts would be cut off one by one. They would apply heat to your skin. You would be permanently made into a galley slave or sent to the mines. Beatings, of course, were quite regular in the ancient world. People didn't value other people as actually even being humans. Outside of your family relationships, everything was legal. By the Middle Ages, they became more refined. The mechanisms of the day started to become more complicated. There was the rack. There was also the first instances of flaying, the actual removal of somebody's skin. The flogging, of course, continued, but the variety of whips used was quite imaginative. These were no longer just livestock crops. There were the stocks and dunking in water, and a cage, the Iron Maiden, also started to be used, where a person was hanged from a tree or hanged from a bar in a public square. There they would simply starve to death slowly, begging for crumbs as from passers-by. And of course, in the Middle Ages, there were way too many things that were put into orifices on the human body. Just go to medieval times or do an online check and you'll see all of those. Pirates. Keelhauling. What is keelhauling? Keelhauling was basically you would tie a rope around somebody, and then you would put the rope around the front of the vessel, and as the vessel sailed over the rope, you would continue to reel it out till it appeared on the other side. So now you had a man attached to one end of a rope that went under the vessel. He would be kicked overboard. This was another example of what they would call by walking the plank. When the person was kicked overboard, he would be dragged from one side of the vessel to the other. Now, as long as he could hold his breath, you would think this was not such a damaging thing. But ancient vessels were loaded with barnacles, so the ordeal dragged somebody through, are you ready for it? A whole field of razors. On the other side, the person would be dragged out, and whether they did it several times or once depended upon the crime he was committing. Of course, pirates always liked to flog. Moses' law was 40 stripes minus 1. I guess it was for the 40 years that the Israelites wandered in the desert. Body parts were frequently cut off. They'd start with ears or noses. If they could mutilate somebody and keep them alive to still work the ship, then redemption could be had. I'll touch briefly on modern tortures, but these sort of enhanced interrogation techniques are another thing that could appear in a modern game, but we probably want to leave them aside. Electric shock came into vogue, and drugs. You could torture somebody with sound and deprivation. The torture devices are quite varied and quite sinister. Now, how do you use torture in role-playing? Most people shy away from a detailed description of what torture they are going to implement on a prisoner. Unless you play with teens, they'll go into quite graphic detail, and everyone assumes that just by giving somebody a good strong tweak on the nose that they'll start to talk. Perhaps the best way is to use degrees. Let the players decide whether they're light, moderate, or heavy, and add some buzzwords on whether or not it's a questioning tone, tickling, probing, a painful and vicious, sadistic attack, or whether you're torturing somebody just to be lethal. If you torture the first prisoner to a lethal extent, the others might be wiser and just start to confess. The effects of torture are the form of the physical damage, the psychological damage, and the information that's given up. Most people do not want to betray their cause. The results should take into account the skills of the torturer, who could be squeamish, inquisitive, playful, cruel, heinous, psychopath. It could also take into account the trait of the victim, whether he's stalwart, weak, indifferent to his cause, or tremendously loyal. In roleplay, you want people to be able to resist torture a lot longer than you physically would in real life. The purpose of the encounter should be clear. It is to gain information. If you wish to elicit a confession, make an example, entertain the crowd, then those are really roleplay aspects that are a bit too heinous for most play. What you want in roleplay is whether or not somebody has information and whether or not you can get it fairly from the rules. It's easy enough to say, well, I start cutting the person from the bottom of his body until I get to his hip, but wouldn't he die? How do you extract information and yet maintain all the good and noble that your character is supposed to exhibit? Most people are not cut out to extract information through torture, and maybe they have to go to an expert, somebody in the field. That could add another NPC that's actually affecting the party. I would look at the levels of the Inquisitor involved, and these could also be levels that the player himself can go through. The first time a character actually inflicts torture, maybe he's just an annoyer. We'll call him level 1. He will ask questions over and over and over, just trying to wear somebody down. If there's any sort of physical threat, it was just merely that, a physical threat. The coercion involves, basically, you could maybe deprive the person for a few days of food and water and soften him up. At level 2, you start to get into the real thuggery. This is where a person single-mindedly just starts beating somebody, asking them questions while they beat them. They might not even give them time to answer, or end up ruining their teeth or tongue or jaw to the point where they cannot answer. When you finally get to level 3, you get a true questioner. This is someone that has some skill. He's obviously gone through his annoying phase and his thuggery phase, and now basically knows what somebody can take. He can size them up. In a game like Cutlass, he's probably a trained slaver who knows what a man actually can endure. A questioner will also understand the human psychology. He'll understand whether or not somebody is just merely trying to stall, or is a true loyalist and may not actually break. When you take the innocent and put him in front of the truly loyal, you maybe, instead of hurting the truly loyal, but by threatening the innocent, you can get what you want. It's sad that I know so much about this, but hopefully it's only from a roleplay standpoint. At level 4, you have a true tormentor. This is somebody that can make discomfort appear in the victim and make it last for pretty much forever. This is usually someone who will never kill a victim. Whether or not he can get the information that's needed quickly or it would take him time, that's probably what he can do. If he ever kills a victim, it's because he needs to force the event. Level 5, we got a true prosecutor. This would be somebody who's worked for the state. He knows all the implements. He's someone that's actually sought out by the kings and nobles to extract confessions from people. At level 6, we call that guy a true punisher. He's a zealot. Even if a person extracts a confession and gets the person punished to recant, this person probably wants to extend the amount of time that he's inflicting or trying to extract information. He likes to know, how long do I have, so he can decide at what level he's going to put the peak of the punishment and when he's going to see the guy confess. And finally, at level 7, you have an Inquisitioner. You can go beyond that and give people penultimate titles like Grand Inquisitioner or Grand Vizier of Executioner. But the Inquisitioner would probably be about as far as you want to take this. Is this an actual D&T style subclass of character? The Inquisitioner character? Torquemada, the greatest of his skills? Well, I hope this will shed some light on a very dark subject, and I welcome any feedback in the chat on whether or not I should be more temperate in my goals of History of Roleplay. More later.